Our speaker this evening is Bob Hibbs. Bob Hibbs came to Iowa City 41 years ago to attend the University of Iowa, and after graduation stayed on. He worked as a reporter and later as a city editor of the Iowa City Press-Citizen during the 1960s, then for several years as a community planner for a local architectural engineering firm called Powers, Willis and Associates. Powers, Willis and Associates. Most of his working career, however, was as a property manager with his office at Lantern Park in Coralville, one of the half-dozen properties that he managed. He and his wife Margaret were married 40 years ago this past June in a country church called Rose Hill in southwest Iowa, near Clarinda, where they were high school sweethearts. Shortly after college, they bought a red house on Reno Street in Iowa City and still live there 34 years later, and the house is still red. They raised two sons in Iowa City, Randy, now in his 17th year in the U.S. Air Force and currently stationed at Mildenhall, England, a few minutes from London, and their other son, Eugene, who after college went out to find the job he wanted and then brought it back to Iowa City, where he now lives. And 32 years later, he's still single. Bob and Margaret also have two grandchildren in Reed and Ethan, who are stationed with their parents in England, where Margaret and Bob travel several times each year to catch up on the latest growth trends. And I can attest to, he's a hard guy to get a hold of. And we were planning this as he was getting ready to go, and so he so graciously said, yes, I'd love to do the history lecture this year, but let me tell you the topic when I get back. I said, that's great. As a retirement hobby, Bob adopted Iowa City history. That sounds familiar. Irving Weber did the same thing. He accumulated an extensive personal library that also includes more than 1,700 different postcard images. Wow, he has written more than 150 articles on local history for the Iowa City Press-Citizen, where his weekly column is called Sunday Postcard. Last October, Bob teamed with the Press-Citizen in a book titled Iowa City, A Sense of Place, that has sold more than 3,000 copies in 9 weeks and is now out of print. And as I was telling the audience before we started, we love this book at our house, and as a matter of fact, my 3-year-old, this is one of his current favorite books, and he loves to sit in a rocking chair, look at the pictures, and sing. And I keep thinking that I need to get my video camera out so I can capture that, because it's just precious. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Bob Hibbs. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. You read what I wrote so well. Hi, thank each of you for coming down to the Iowa City Public Library to be with us for this program. And thank each of you on television for joining us this evening and later on with rebroadcasts. I would start with telling a tale out of school. The book was mentioned, and with every book project, I'm sure there are things that happen that weren't scheduled to happen. And one of the things that happened with respect to this book, one of many, is that a little article about the front cover of the book got omitted from the final text. Now, this cover, it is explained in the cover who the people are in the book if you dig it out. But more importantly is the Iowa City Sense of Place name at the top. This material is actually in Chauncey Swann's handwriting. And what one of the technicians did at the newspaper was take that handwriting, which appeared on a oath of office that he took as commissioner to come to Iowa City, and he just cut out the individual letters and reassembled them and then darkened up the Iowa City real darkly and not so much the Sense of Place subtitle. So this title is actually in the handwriting of Chauncey Swann, our city founder. Our program this evening, I want to tell some tales that are sometimes a little offbeat, and I hope you'll enjoy. Iowa City was, is, and always will be a delightfully unique place in the universe, peopled by a pantheon of bubbling personalities and towering intellects. and sometimes you can't tell the difference. And sometimes they're the same person. They've built impressive edifices, comfortable homes, inspiring skywalks and awful monstrosities, and sometimes one isn't certain how to discern the difference. And sometimes they're at the same site. You and I have come to respect, if not to love, the idiosyncrasies which make Iowa City truly unique. As it's said that New York City is not New York, so Iowa City is not Iowa. It's far too rebellious, far too intelligent, far too nutty, far too cosmopolitan. Yet from any home in Iowa City, it is typically little more than a few minutes to a field of corn, to the open countryside, to the Coralville Lake. The range of personalities and political persuasions among those who have served on our local governing bodies through the years is beyond description. Often the morning newspaper brings letters to the editor which enrage the soul, which bring a nod of agreement, which toy with the intellect, which dishearten the spirit, which make one smile. All on the same page the same morning. It's wonderful. Discussion at local coffee shops ranges from the mundane of daily life to Earth's place in the cosmos. From the newest treatment for Alzheimer's to the latest political squabble. From the most recent Broadway hit currently playing at Hancher Auditorium in Iowa City to the latest book by an Iowa author climbing the New York Times bestseller list. From the current health food diet to a recommendation for a wonderful little out-of-the-way cafe near Kensington Palace in central London called Maggie Jones. Iowa City is Iowa City. There's no place quite like it. It's been that way from the very beginning. Consider founding father Chauncey Swann. He was a respected territorial legislator elected in 1838 from Dubuque to the first legislative session of the new territory of Iowa held in Burlington. That legislature and the governor sent him into a wilderness dubbed Johnson County. He and two fellow legislators were to select a site for the capital of the new territory, which the legislature had named Iowa City. The other legislators were John Ronalds and Robert Ralston, for whom a local street and creek are named. When neither of them showed up on time, Chauncey Swann sent a rider on horseback to retrieve Ronalds so the selection work could be considered legal. With two members of a three-man committee, a quorum would have been present. Since the 70-mile round trip through a wilderness without roads could hardly fit into the afternoon and evening allocated to it, tales remain that when Ronalds finally arrived, Chauncey Swann chose to read his watch earlier than reality. Swann then managed the layout of Iowa City and handled local lot sales for the territory. He served as postmaster, moving the post office into town from a trading post near what is now called Napoleon Park. He initiated the construction of Old Capitol. He developed his own hotel near what is on the Pentecrest. He developed his own hotel just across Jefferson Street to the north. He was a founding member of many local organizations, including the Masonic Lodge and the Presbyterian Church. All in all, Chauncey Swann was a pillar of the community. So what happened when the California gold fever arrived in Iowa City in 1849? He picked up stakes and headed west and died at sea a couple of years later on his return voyage. a towering intellect, or a bubbling personality? Perhaps both. There are many interesting, even inspiring buildings in Iowa City. Church steeples spire toward the sky. University buildings mark the glorious architectural periods, ancient and modern. Home styles range from Creekside Moffett to California Ramblers and modernistic mansions. There were few, if any, local residents who ever loved a building called Close Hall, which from 1890 until 1971 occupied the northwest quadrant of the Iowa Avenue intersection with Dubuque Street. It was designed by a University of Iowa engineering professor, built with donations, including a sizable gift from the Close family, whose name is Bohr, and designed as a YWYMCA in an age when attitudes toward students' activities was at least paternalistic. Squarely on the corner of that intersection, towering up 3 stories, standing on huge, dominant marble columns, was a corner turret that was capped by a pitched round roof that looked for all the world like a dunce cap. Enjoyed by students early for the showers that were provided in its gymnasium and rarely available elsewhere, it became, as it aged, something of a campus joke. After its formation in 1923, the School of Journalism, my college at the university, occupied Close Hall. The basement was filled with mechanical shop and printing press for the Daily Iowa student newspaper. I worked in that shop as a student. In 1940, when told Iowa City firemen were battling a blaze in Close Hall, University of Iowa President Eugene Gilmore is said to have quipped, "Why don't they mind their own business?" Although Close Hall is gone from the local scene, one of its sturdy marble columns survives in Oakland Cemetery as the grave marker for Nina and Arthur Pickering. Now each of us, you and I, were introduced to Iowa City in a unique way, whether by birth or choice. Mine involved moving from small Iowa farm community to attend the university in the footsteps of my 4 siblings. I remember those cold walks from Quadrangle across the bridge at Iowa Avenue to classes on Pentecrest. But even more, I remember seeing a huge 2.5-story white clapboard house in the middle of the intersection at the west end of the Burlington Street Bridge, with police squad cars facing it from all 4 directions with their lights abusing the eyes of everyone who looked on. Seems the local house mover was at it again without proper permits authorizing such a move. The city had decided to stop it once and for all, to take the house and demolish it on the spot. A problem developed when the mover decided the house was not going to be demolished and chose to sit on the big front porch in a rocking chair in the middle of the intersection with a shotgun positioned across his lap as the spokesman for his viewpoint. Although I'm not sure how it all ended peacefully. Guess a judge ordered the house moved on its way after the appropriate fine had been paid by the house mover. His name, by the way, is Max Yoakum, who rode this new notoriety to election as a member of the Iowa City City Council, now some 3 decades ago. Bubbling personality, I question the thought of anything towering. Let's now turn to a few words from our patron this week, Irving Weber. In an article published in the Iowa City Press Citizen, June 30, 1990, Weber writes, "The funeral of Mrs. Herrick was conducted just before Christmas in 1870. and she was buried in Oakland Cemetery. The next day, the sexton at the cemetery thought the grave had been disturbed. Authorities opened the grave and discovered Mrs. Herrick's body had been stolen. The finger of suspicion immediately was pointed at the new College of Medicine's anatomy department. A search warrant was issued, and the guilty department hurriedly removed the body from Old South Hall, which was right next to Old Cap, and hid it under a haystack 3 miles west of town, about where West High is today. The culprits, whoever they were advised in the newspaper that a casket would be rolled out in the back of the mortuary in the Metropolitan Building, which is where the Jefferson Hotel sits today. If the body was returned before midnight, there would be no prosecution. Somehow bodies and caskets and midnight go together. If the body was returned before midnight, there would be no prosecution. The body was returned. To add just a bit to Weber's telling of the story, it was later established that the guilty party was the anatomy department's jack of all trades, Dominic Bradley, who was fired for his part in the endeavor. No doubt a political necessity. The incident also resulted in the legislature granting to the UI Medical School the right to all unclaimed bodies from Iowa's prisons. So they didn't have to take them from the cemetery. And while we're on the subject of the med school, there is the story of the cistern filled with human bones found as construction got underway on Pentecrest for McLean Hall. That cistern had been located in the basement of the 1882 medical school, which had burned down in 1901. The cistern had been used for disposal of human remains used in anatomy classes and apparently had been overlooked in the half a dozen years from the time of the fire in 1901 until the start of construction of McLean Hall. Excavation was halted immediately when the bones were found. After University President George McLean determined the nature of the find, he arranged removal of the material at night quietly. Years afterward, McLean clearly reveled in retelling the tale, and he's quoted in the retellings that he always ended it with the quip, "And that was the only order I ever gave during my administration, which was not countermanded by the State Board of Education." Perhaps for the record we should add that deeded bodies now to the medical program are cremated after they're used in the anatomy classes, and the ashes are buried with appropriate ceremony in Iowa City's Oakland Cemetery. Seems things have come full circle. Let's continue for a moment on the University of Pentecrest surrounding Old Cap. John Gerber relates in his 1988 Pictorial History of the University of Iowa, which by the way is still available in the bookstores if you're interested, that during 1924, the grounds around Old Cap that we call now Pentecrest were being called Five Spot. This was at the time of the construction of Jessup Hall, which was the last of the 4 buildings that surround Old Cap. There were still 2 older red bricks in place, North Hall and Old Dental, but they seem not to have counted. The developed paradigm at that time was a complete shift away from the red brick campus represented by the older row of 5 buildings with Old Cap at the center, the row of red bricks right along the break down to the river. The new vision was the modern Beaux-Arts fourplex around Old Cap, which exists today. Schaeffer Hall came into use in 1902, followed by McBride in 08, McLean in 12, and now Jessup Hall in 1924. But North Hall would not be demolished until 1949. Old Dental not until 1975. During the 1924 watershed year, Old Cap was undergoing its first full-scale updating since initial construction was stopped during the 1850s. Notice the word used is stopped, since Old Capitol had never been completed. In addition to a new steel superstructure and extensive major repairs to Old Cap, the 1920s brought with it the West Portico, which had been contemplated in original plans but never actually built. Portico, what a wonderful word, portico. It's just a fancy French word for porch. The West Porch, wow, that doesn't sound quite the same, does it? The West Portico also brought with it West Terraces, with sidewalks running down the hill to the 1904 Men's Gym, to the university's athletic facilities complex in Athletic Park located along the riverbank, and soon would lead to an entirely new hospital and sports campus west of the river. What was going on in 1924 was a physical recognition reflected around Old Cap that Iowa City was also to have a full-blown Western Hemisphere that forever breached the wall represented by the Iowa River. Gerber reports that on December 11, 1924, the Daily Iowan student newspaper published a headline reading, "5-spot called weak name for Iowa's campus, seek another." He wrote that one professor was quoted as saying the designation 5-spot was rather lowbrow and commonplace. A young political science professor named Benjamin Shambaugh opined in that 1924 newspaper article that the only really appropriate name for the area was Old Capitol Campus. Shambaugh later would write the 1939 epic centennial history of Iowa City disguised under the name The Old Stone Capitol Remembers. Almost no one ever uses the remainder of the book's title, Old Stone Capitol Remembers When Iowa City Was Young. But in 1924, the student newspaper championed a public contest which resulted in the official naming of the heart of Iowa City and the university as Pentecrest. As they say now, you know the rest of the story. It's interesting how characters and events interrelate and blend into a flow of community history. Such is the case with a focus for a moment on the 1872 fire that razed the then 19-year-old Clinton House Hotel. It sat in the southeast quadrant of the Clinton College intersection, a site in downtown Iowa City occupied by what is now called the Savings and Loan Building. The fire is important in local history. It opened space for construction of the Cauldron Opera House, which became an important institution in Iowa City during the last quarter of the 19th century. It served as the dominant venue even for concerts, plays, and community events of all sorts, even for inauguration of University of Iowa presidents. The Cauldron, in turn, yielded to the Englert Theater when that later institution was opened in 1912. The fire at the Clinton House Hotel was important too in that it raised anew the issue of fire protection, although it would be another 40 years before local protection became properly funded through taxation. At that time, frequently fire units around town were supported by a business or two. And at that time, too, later, there was the evolution from volunteer to paid professional firefighters. The Clinton House fire also resulted in reconstruction and expansion of the 1853 Workman Building, which was located at the corner of Iowa Avenue and Clinton Street, to create the St. James Hotel. It represented a successor to the Clinton House as the community's finest hotel. Again, the St. James was built of wood and 44 years later would suffer the same fate, leveled by fire. The Jefferson Hotel had taken the crown of the finest local hotel away from the St. James when the Jefferson was opened in 1913. The Jefferson was erected at Washington and Dubuque Streets on a site opened the previous year when fire destroyed the 1858 wood frame Metropolitan Building. Not surprisingly, the Jefferson initiated its advertising campaign by calling itself fireproof. But back to the Clinton House fire in 1872. In addition to being important, the fire is interesting in the stories it created for telling and retelling as historical vignettes. It broke out at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was virtually no fire protection in Iowa City or in any other community that size at that time. Wood was the principal building material, and after years of drying out, as the building aged, wood burned quick and intense, with almost no hope of control beyond keeping nearby roofs wet so that flying embers didn't burn down whole blocks, which incidentally also actually happened in Iowa City, when a Civil War era fire burned most of the buildings along Dubuque Street between Iowa Avenue and Washington Street, right downtown. Guests at the Clinton House the night it burned included a noted violinist of that era who billed himself as Old Bull, kind of an early day Jack Benny for those of us of our age, who had given a local concert that night before he turned in. Along with others, this distinguished guest escaped the fire in his nightgown as a brisk north wind which continued to fan the flames. The crowd was stirred to laughter as he scurried about the fire lines in his nightclothes with what was reported to have been a death clutch on his fiddle. A watchman named George Andrews had alerted guests to evacuate and had climbed a ladder to Old Bull's room and rescued his trunk and other valuables from the burning building. But minutes later, as the fire progressed rapidly, Old Bull suddenly realized that a prize watch still was in his room. He offered $50, a princely sum in that day, to anyone who would enter the building and retrieve his watch. A fellow by the name of George Herron accepted, and Herron was successful and received full payment as the crowd watched. Now, fire also has shaped the university campus through its first century of its history. Fortunately, they haven't had major fires recently, because modern construction methods and materials now make major fires a rare event. Even when fire does get a start, modern equipment and techniques practiced by professionals often limit damage from fire, although the awful spectacle of water damage has been elevated to new heights. One can hardly avoid bringing to mind the recent fire which vaporized the belfry, cupola, and dome of Old Capitol. The entire building would have been gutted, except that the 1924's renovation had included installation of a concrete floor in the attic as a fire barrier. It represented a concern in those years for lightning strikes, since Old Cap had been struck directly at least twice during the previous 2 decades. But the Old Cap Dome fire is hardly the first major blaze on Pentecrest. 3 earlier fires were disastrous, including the death of Iowa City fireman Kirk Leak. Only one other local firefighter, Robert Hine, in the 1971 Mercy Hospital fire, have died in the line of duty during 163 years the city has existed. The university was first opened in the Mechanics Academy on Lynn Street, just 2 blocks north of here, in 1855. Some of you may immediately bring to mind the 1847 date, and the university was created on paper in 1847, but the first class wasn't offered until 1855. And UI inherited Pentecrest and Old Capitol with the departure of state government to Des Moines in 1857. However, a federal district court judge continued to use the chambers in Old Cap for a time after that, apparently with the blessing of the administration and university trustees. It hardly mattered anyway, since the university was closed the following year for a 2-year period before finally being reopened for good in 1860. 3 years later, a planned boarding hall next to Old Cap, which became almost immediately a classroom building, was opened directly south of the venerable old building. Of course, it was named South Hall. Then came a chapel and science hall, opened in 1866 on the opposite flank of home plate, named, of course, North Hall. The medical building was added in 1882 at the south end of the red brick row next to Washington Street, followed in 1884 by Calvin Hall at the other end next to Jefferson Street, but was 75 feet east, out of line with the row of red bricks. But Calvin exited Pentecrest, was moved across the street, all 6,000 tons of it, in 1905 to its present location. Next on Pentecrest in 1895 came the old dental building, erected adjacent to the original site of Calvin Hall right off Jefferson Street and completing that row of the red brick campus on either flank of Old Cap. Of these 6 principal university buildings, all originally on Pentecrest, 3 of them, fully half, were destroyed by fire. Fire has been so often a friend, providing heat and light to our species from the beginning of recorded history. Fireplaces and wood stoves were the original method of heating in Old Capitol, and reading light was provided by tallow candles. But lightning bolts often have been the culprits. The first building to suffer was North Hall when it was struck by lightning in June 1897. Although virtually destroyed, a combination of legislative politics and state funding forced its reconstruction rather than replacement. Then on September 23, 1898, came the untimely death of the only university president ever to die in office, Charles Schaeffer, the dynamo planner and fundraiser who, just the year before his death, had convinced the Iowa legislature to impose for 5 years a 1 mil statewide property tax levy to fund university buildings. Can you imagine today a university president convincing a state legislature to adopt a new property tax statewide to fund buildings in Iowa City? Charles Schaeffer did that in 1896. It eventually was even extended for another 5 years and became a centerpiece for the university's ability to proceed with major campus buildings. Erection of the building which eventually would bear his name was begun the same year that Charles Schaeffer died. The second tragic fire fortunately caused no deaths, but the spectacular blaze during the early morning hours of March the 10th, 1901, just 101 years ago, destroyed both the medical building and South Hall. A nasty blow to the university in wiping out 1/4 of its entire physical plant in one fell swoop. There's over 100 buildings today at the university, and if it lost 25 buildings in one night, that would be comparable to what happened to it in 1901. The fire started in the medical building at the south end of Red Brick Row, next to Washington Street, and quickly spread next door to South Hall, located just 25 feet away. There was fear that the Kirkwood Hotel, later called the Berkeley Imperial Hotel, and located immediately across the Washington Street to the south, there was concern that it would catch fire from wind-blown embers. There also was considerable fear that Old Cap itself would be engulfed, since it was only 80 feet north of South Hall. And had that wind not been that night coming from the north and blowing it toward the wide Washington Street right-of-way rather than the other way, Old Cap could have been lost. But fortunately, the eventualities never materialized, except the loss of South Hall and the medical building, which set off a scurry for replacement space. an appeal to the legislature and alumni for funds, and to the faculty and students to help build a temporary structure on the foundations of South Hall. All the appeals bore fruit in time, including the student-faculty-built one-story structure nicknamed the Sheep Shed, and used for nearly a decade on the Pentecrest campus. Money from the state permitted construction of Anatomy Hall in the center of the block east of Pentecrest, kind of at the southeast corner of the Congregational Church, behind Phillips Hall, or east of Phillips Hall. Anatomy Hall still exists today and has been recently renovated as the Biological Sciences Library. In addition to it, funds were provided for new medical classrooms in the form of a 3-story stone structure catty-cornered across the Dubuque-Jefferson intersection from the First United Methodist Church. It still exists. 1904 Medical Hall has currently just been completed on renovation for laboratories building for that same Biological Sciences Department. Another disastrous fire on Pentecrest occurred in 1914 when a blaze leveled the original 30-foot by 40-foot armory and heating plant building located just 45 feet west of Old Cap. Ironically, it had been built in 1882 to provide steam to radiators in Old Cap to eliminate use of wood stoves and fireplaces as a safety measure. The upstairs, above the boiler room, was used as an armory for the military department of the university, and later as a drafting room. By the time of the fire, 1914, the armory had been moved down the hill into new quarters in the men's gym, so that this decade later, the space next to Old Cap was being used as a carpentry shop and catch-all. As it burned, fire seared the paint on the west eaves and overhang of Old Cap, but the historic landmark, again, was spared. Really remarkable how many fires have occurred around Old Cap, and it was 2002 before a welder's torch or whatever caught the dome on fire. Any list of important historic buildings in Iowa City would include one called the Mechanics Academy. It probably belongs right below Old Capitol on any list of important buildings. It was a small 3-level structure, actually 2 levels and a half. Half the basement was in the ground, and 2 levels above the basement. It was built in 1842 on the east face of Lynn Street, midway between Iowa Avenue and Jefferson Street, on a public lot reserved on the original plat of Iowa City for school use. The lot was huge by standards of that day, a full block of frontage on Lynn Street and half a block deep away from Lynn Street. The building covered about the same portion of the lot as a postage stamp covers a business envelope. It faced across Lynn Street to an entire square block of City Park, which incidentally the City Council gave to the University of Iowa in 1890 to stave off serious talk in the legislature that the university should be moved to a more central location in the state. The Academy building, although considerably smaller, bore a distinct resemblance to Old Cap, but without the grandeur that its proper proportions bestow on the Capitol building. The construction crew was headed by Louis Swafford, a premier builder of that era who also was a founding member of the Iowa City Masonic Lodge and who carries the distinction of heading the lodge a total of 7 years, longer than any other man during its 160-year history in Iowa City. The construction crew also included a fellow by the name of Robert Hutchinson, who in 1840, just 2 years earlier, had built the distinctive stone farmhouse west of the Iowa River beside a trail now called Park Road, which since 1977 has been home to the University of Iowa Press. Hutchinson later helped erect the church that today we call Old Brick. During the 55 years the Mechanics Academy existed, the list of its uses and the events that occurred there is utterly phenomenal. The private school intended when it was built lasted but a short time before the building entered public use. Among the attributes of this little old building, in 1853, the first Iowa City public school class was held there, founding our Iowa City Community Schools. In 1855, the first university classes were held there. That same year, University Library was founded there in one of its closets. In 1860, the first teacher training class was held there in the Mechanics Academy, called a normal school, as a forerunner to what is now the University of Northern Iowa. In 1866, after years of rental, it was purchased by the university as a men's residence hall. The seller was the same Robert Hutchinson who had helped build it and who had, in the interim, acquired its outstanding shares of stock since it was a failure of its original intent. In 1872, the first UI College of Medicine hospital was opened there. That same year, the Sisters of Mercy from Davenport first worked in Iowa City in this building, seeding the creation of Mercy Hospital. Other key local events occurred there, including the foundation of several local churches and organizations. The building also housed the State Historical Society of Iowa for a time during its incubation period. But when the Academy building was demolished in 1897 to make way for the first section of a new university hospital, its cornerstone from the Mechanics Academy was at first reset in a protected area outside on a wall of the new hospital building. When the new medical labs were built west of the Iowa River, the cornerstone was reset over there. Today, that cornerstone still occupies a spot in the east vestibule of the Med Labs building, hidden immediately west or behind the Bowen Science Building. Clearly, this historic cornerstone should be relocated to a more public spot, accompanied by appropriate interpretive material to give the public a feeling for the importance of this lonely little structure. Perhaps a protective kiosk could be provided in the Iowa Avenue right-of-way near the original site of this important gem. That could fit handsomely into the new streetscape recently developed with quotations of writers in the walk from local connections. Such a cornerstone project clearly is worthy of serious consideration. Now, one more quick vignette, and we'll turn to questions, as Cara has indicated. John Dostal was a local brewer. He was quite a successful man, owning the Great Western Brewery, which later was also called Dostal Brothers Brewery, one of 3 breweries in Iowa City during the middle of the 19th century. That's more breweries than operated in the entire state during most of the state's existence, until the modern advent of microbreweries and what we call brew pubs today. But after all, Iowa City was settled by a large number of Germans, Eastern European, and Irish, groups that have a reputation for being willing to tip an occasional brew. The last census still shows a quarter of the local population calling itself of German extraction. Dostal built a mansion at Van Buren and Bloomington Streets, which the Sisters of Mercy purchased in 1884 as the first element of what today is Mercy Hospital, which now extends through that block and fronts onto Market Street. Dostal also had a boat. In those days, there were no gasoline outboard motors. Rather, he had a boiler on board and it drove a small paddle wheel. Steamer, they were called. During the Great Flood in Iowa City of 1881, Dostal rode his horse and buggy up to the marina where his boat was tied up, located just upstream from what today is called the Butler Bridge on the road north from Iowa City to River Heights. He powered up his steamer and came barreling downriver. As he passed through Coralville, he steered his boat onto First Avenue on what is now the area west of the Iowa River Power Company restaurant to avoid the turbulent waters that the dam site was creating in Coralville. He reveled in the journey, and when he got to Iowa City, he found a message to take supplies on his return trip back to those stranded in Coralville. His is the only steamer ever recorded using the streets of Coralville. In closing, I return to my beginning. Iowa City was, is, and always will be a delightfully unique place in the universe, peopled by a pantheon of bubbling personalities and towering intellects, and sometimes you can't tell the difference. And sometimes they are the same person. They've built impressive edifices, comfortable homes, inspiring skywalks and awful monstrosities, and sometimes one isn't certain how to discern the difference. And sometimes they're at the same site. You and I have come to respect, if not to love, the idiosyncrasies which make Iowa City truly unique. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Questions? Well, I have a question about your book, and I know that it's out of print, and I'm wondering if there are any plans for it to be reprinted.
Many of you know Dan Brown at the Press Citizen, and Dan has indicated to me that the Press Citizen is interested in another book. And I suspect this next year, 2003, will produce another volume 2, so to speak. We enjoyed doing that book tremendously. We started out with the thought that if we appealed to the public through the advertising pages of the Press Citizen, we appealed to the public for pictures. And our thought was that the great archives of pictorial history in, you name the location, the University Archives, the State Historical Society, the Johnson County Historical Society, or any place you want, come from people that just throw their pictures at them. So the pictures in these archives that we think are so great from olden times are just what people provided. So why not ask people to provide pictures for a book and see what happens? And we thought we needed 250 pictures or so. And so when we first started taking pictures, the staff person at the Press Citizen who handled that had to keep the bar pretty low because we didn't expect to, get 250 pictures that were, we just hoped the public would respond. We ended up with more than 1,700 pictures offered, of which we had accepted more than 400, and we only published about 240. So we know there are great pictures out there available, and it does take some research, and that's where I came into the picture, because I know very well that many of the folks could tell us almost nothing about the picture they were providing. It was a nice old picture, an image, great image, but no information about it. I have an extensive library at home. I have developed through the last 10 years or so, including a very large number of old Iowa City directories. They are an invaluable tool for a researcher. And although the State Historical Society and the University Archives are available to researchers, they're very inconvenient for me. And so I have thought I had to gather my own material. I have extensive collections of old annals of Iowa, of this and that and the other thing. I have over 100 books of just Iowa City histories, going back to the original copy of the 1883 history of Johnson County, on up through the rest of them. And I love these old books. They're like my kids now. And but anyway, that's the way that the research for this type of book can be done without spending hours and hours and hours and hours in unfamiliar facilities with unfamiliar locations of where particular books might be located. And of course, in reading for 6 or 8 years now, one accumulates a store of knowledge of where something is located. I am not one that remembers real well that Iowa City was laid out in 1839. But I know where to look if I can't remember a date or if I can't remember a person's name, and I'm terrible with that sort of thing. I'm not good at exams in that sense. But I do know the local materials, and I do know local images, so I can relate those things. That's a long answer to a short question. Thanks, Carl.
Bob, earlier you talked of Chauncey Swann and his importance to Iowa City. In preparation for the Quiz Bowl tomorrow night, I read of his rather ignoble finish or end to a noble life. Do you know that ignoble end of his life?
Let me speculate with you. Chauncey Swann was a member of the Iowa City Masonic Lodge, and I've been involved with the lodge for 25 years and know its records very well. Chauncey Swann is replete through the records of the early years of Iowa City Lodge. There is a long, flowery entry in the minutes of when he left in 1849 for Chauncey Swann. There is only a small notation that he died 2 years later in the Masonic Records. No real obituary or anything like that. I can only speculate, and we do know that he died at sea in New York Harbor, not far out at sea, and was buried at sea. But we also know he wrote back to Iowa City, for he left a second wife here. His first wife, Dolly, had died, and to defend Chauncey's willingness to pull up stakes and run off to the gold rush, his only child, his daughter, had died and was is buried in Oakland Cemetery. I think the first burial there. And his wife, Dolly, died and was buried there. He married a second time to a lady who he had been the executor of the estate for her husband when he died. But I don't think that marriage was close. He picked up and left, but he did write back occasionally. And there is some meager evidence that he didn't find much in California. He was broke. He went out there by wagon over land, which was inexpensive but very hard, particularly for a man then of his age. But he came back, he found money, and came back, bought passage around South America by ship to get to New York Harbor. Where did that money come from? And I've always thought that maybe some way or another he managed to accumulate a little money, the tail end of his time in California, bought his passage home, and that some scullydug wanted his purse before he got off the ship. And that was not uncommon in those years. But there's no real record. I have spent hours and hours and have a library card to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., because my son was stationed there for a while, and I was going regularly and looked at a lot of old material. I hope that Randy is someday stationed in New York City so I can get into the harbor records and see if I can find anything that records Chauncey Swann's death. But he died aboard ship. I think that it's pure speculation, but I would like to establish what caused his death.
Are there other questions?
What is the time, anticipated time of this book being published?
What is the anticipated time of your next book being published?
We haven't gotten to that stage at all yet, but the marketing department of the Press Citizen, which is tied into Gannett, they are very wise people. And they've got a lot of experience of this and that and the other thing. And they'd established the cycle for the last book sales, which to sell 3,000 books in a market of 50, 60,000 people is phenomenal. We sold the books out in 8 or 9 weeks. That's not my writing that does that. That's the power of promotion of an organization that knows what it's doing. And they established the time frame of publication in October so that it's in the Christmas season for books and that sort of thing. And we had a large sale of books that were sent, mailed out of the area. So we know people bought Christmas gifts and had them mailed. And so I would suspect a fair statement would be it'll be a similar cycle. But I'm not the marketing end of things, and I don't make those decisions. But I would not be surprised if publication were much like this last cycle. In October, we'll publish the book.
But it would be 4 years from now, or?
No, I think this probably next year, 2003. But again, I'm just, nothing has been established in stone at all.
You haven't started it yet?
No, not in that sense, because I assume we'll appeal for pictures again. And the research, obviously, I do research every week for a column for the paper. And so my interest and research is ongoing. And in that sense, you're getting prepared, because when somebody throws your picture at you, you can say, oh, yeah, that, so. And that's what got me interested in Iowa City history. I really started collecting postcards as a self-defense. My wife is here tonight, so I've got to be careful how I tell this story. But Margaret is interested she collects toys. She has the most fabulous toy collection, McDonald's toys, that you can imagine. But she also was collecting glassware. She has a wonderful collection of depression glass. And as we were going to garage sales and flea markets and antique stores and what have you, I wasn't interested in those things. So I started looking at postcards, 10, 12, 15 years ago now. They were a dime, a quarter, $1. That was a high-priced card. So I started buying images. Well, when I'd had an image in front of me, I'd say, what the heck is that? And what's the history of that? So I began to research the history of what I was seeing in the images. And that's what got me started into this business of Iowa City history. And I'm still young enough that I hope I have a couple more years to enjoy that sort of thing, because it's become a daily part of my life of reading and writing and thinking about local history, which I thoroughly enjoy.
What's going to happen to that particular collection?
Yep.
What's going to happen to your postcard collection?
It will end up in the public domain. I will see that I need an institution that will house it eventually, that I'm sure will be ongoing and that sort of thing. It won't be sold. They're kids. I can't sell a postcard. It's like a child. And postcards now, a very mundane, ordinary, common card will sell for $2 or $3. The really rare cards, there was one sold, which I have two variations of, down in Lone Tree at an auction not long ago, sold for $325 for one card. Now that's rare, and that was a couple of bidders that really wanted it. But $50 on a card now is not uncommon. I mean, it's uncommon in the sense that most of them sell for $2 or $3 or $4. But I'm glad that I accumulated my collection when I did, because I wouldn't want to be out there trying to accumulate a big collection today. Yes? Go ahead.
I assume that you found most of your postcards around this area. How far have you had to travel to get a postcard about Iowa City?
How far have you had to travel to get a postcard?
Have you found them?
That's an interesting question. I have found postcards literally from coast to coast. Literally. Because people mailed them from here, of course, all over the country, back when it was a penny, The great postcard era is from about 1905 until the before World War II, really, to the 40s, when communication was difficult. And people would send a postcard to say, Mother had surgery at University Hospital and is fine. Today, you wouldn't send a postcard to do that. You'd pick up the phone, probably your cellular, and tell them right away. But that was an important form of communication back then. My son, who is in the Air Force, that was mentioned in the introduction, he has gone from New Hampshire to South Carolina to Georgia to Washington State to Washington, D.C. in his service in the Air Force. And we, of course, have gone to see our kids, of course, but also to see our grandchildren. And you stop in junk stores along the way to find a beloved toy. And I have found postcards in the same medium. And my wife is contributing at the back of the room, and I have no idea.
She's saying that you've discovered internet shopping also.
Yes, yes, yes. I have bought a couple hundred items on the internet now, so I am an internet shopper. I have bought letter openers, and I have bought all kinds. It has to have a clear Iowa City connection. But I do buy things on the internet right along. Including, by the way, postcards. I have bought several postcards on the internet this year. I recently acquired my 1700th postcard. Only a couple of weeks ago. No, a couple of days ago, really. And it was a picture of Old Cap. I have more than 130, 140 cards of Old Cap. But there was something about the twist of the building that showed the south wall of Old Cap. I said, I don't have a picture like that shows that south wall. And it is a variation of another card, or several other cards that you have. But most pictures of Old Cap are taken kind of looking southwest. So you see the north face of Old Cap and the east face. That's the standard shot. That's the one that Bertha made.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Bertha Shamball did the wonderful picture of in charcoal and oil and things. It's hanging, I think it's still hanging in Old Cap. I hope it is. And that's the standard view of Old Cap. This picture was a little different, and it turned out to be my 1700th postcard. I paid $2 for it, by the way. Was tickled to get it.
Well, and Margaret just added that it was from what year? Is that where you found it?
That's right. Absolutely. We were out at Watch Here this last weekend.
Is Old Capitol closed up today, or is it open?
The question is Old Capitol closed up today, or is it open?
It's closed. It's closed. I don't think I have not heard, I shouldn't make any announcements for them, but I have not heard any discussion of when it might be reopened. It's a long ways away because the water damage through floor after floor over there is extensive to the building. Interestingly enough, it flowed down in the walls and did not damage much the furnishings and the books and other things that were in the building. It's the building itself that got damaged. And as you know, they're talking $6.5 million in repairs now. Hopefully in the next 6 months, the dome will reappear, the upper portions, exterior, so that we have the image back. But the interior is a long ways off. They're working with it. They've recently done tests with the stairs. Interestingly, you may have seen the picture in the paper or on TV of the sand sacks. They covered that wonderful spiral staircase with as many sacks of 40 and 50 pounds of sand as they could, as to see that it would hold more people than could stand on the steps at one time. And it did. The stairs are all right. They need some repair from water, but they're okay structurally. That's the kind of thing that's going on. But it will be, and it would be a wild guess, but it will not be anytime soon that Old Cap will be reopened to the public.
Yes.
Well, probably a number of other people saw this report in the press in the last day or two. I can't remember if it was TV or print, but that the university's going to mount a webcam on Phillips
Oh, that the university is going to mount a web camera on Phillips Hall, sort of like the corn camera and the soybean camera, and now there's going to be an old cap camera on Phillips Hall. And I think the article in the paper said that it was to show the reconstruction, but also the daily life on the Penacrest, too. That's neat. Yes, question?
Bob, you mentioned the Clinton House, and I think I read one time where a favorite of mine, Mark Twain, was a visitor or a guest once at the Clinton House. Has your research told you anything about that visit, where he was speaking when he was in Iowa City, or what happened during that time?
As I've said a little earlier, I hate to recall details off, but yes, I know something of that visit. He spoke in the Metropolitan Hall that had the casket brought out behind it later time. He also fell on ice over here at the corner of Lynn Street and Washington Street, in that corner, and hurt his hip pretty badly on that fall. And he hated Iowa City and said so publicly, that because of he slipped on the ice in the street out there and fell and hurt his hip so badly. But yes, he spoke in the Metropolitan Hall and so forth, yes.
Another comment on that. At the hotel, he had left a call for 10 o'clock in the morning, and the clerk called him at 6 in the morning, and he was very upset about that.
That I hadn't heard before. That's wonderful. And repeating for people that can't hear from the audience, and that's what Cara is doing, is repeating so that folks that aren't here can hear the question as well. But the comment is made, which is a wonderful story, that Mark Twain, when he was visiting Iowa City, in 1850-something, somewhere way back. But anyway, left a message at his hotel to be called at 10 a.m., and the clerk called him at 6 a.m. And if you know the character of Samuel Clemens, Samuel Clemens was a whiskey-drinking, cigar-smoking old man with a tremendous wit. But he was not to be trifled with. And that's another reason, I'm sure, that he didn't like Iowa City. It was a combination of events.
Yes.
The Lions put out Irving's columns, and now you said you have 150 you've done, so I'm wondering if the Masons are going to put out a book of your columns.
I wouldn't speak for the Masons. I wouldn't speak to that at all.
Well, I'm encouraging them to do that.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. She's suggesting that the Masons should publish a book of my columns, and
I suggest you
I
join
can't
Lions.
speak. I can't speak.
Lions.
Daryl is suggesting that you join the Lions Club.
On the back row.
When I first moved to Iowa City, I was told that many people in Iowa perceived it to be Sin City, Iowa.
First moved to Iowa City, he was told that people perceived that Iowa City was Sin City, Iowa.
That Iowa City was.
Sin City?
Oh, Sin City.
A den of
Oh, I
vice.
think without a doubt that's true. No, stories are told and retold, and when 19-year-olds come to the university and go to school and leave 4 years later, hopefully, with a degree, they create their own stories, and that has been going on, interestingly enough, since the very early years of the university. Several university presidents had major problems with stories that were told about events at the university which were quite a bit different than reality. But yeah, you would be told Iowa City was Sin City. But then that could elicit a long comment, and I won't do that right now, but a long comment about what sin is and what ought to be going on while you're growing up. You know, I've raised two sons, and I'm very, very proud of both of them, and I always thought, and good Lord, hide their mother's eyes when they're a certain age, because they need a certain amount of what I used to call bellying up to the bar. And that's a bad slang term in modern thought about drinking alcohol, the abuse of alcohol. But that's not really what I was referring to. They need a certain amount of growing up. You've got to have the experiences. I can remember, and Eugene will kill me for this, but I can remember going down to the sheriff's office at 10 o'clock one night when the sheriff had called that they had our son and several other boys at the sheriff's office, at the jail. They were about 14 years old at the time. And somebody had hit the back window of a bus with a BB from a BB gun and had cracked that window. And the campus police had seen some boys climbing around the construction site of the Boyd Law Building. And Eugene had been over in that area and ended up at the sheriff's office. And we walked in, and I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, they picked us up, and they want to know if I can get, if they can keep my BB gun." And I said, "Of course they can keep your BB gun," you know, that sort of thing. But Eugene said later, and he and I have become very close because he's here in Iowa City. He said, "You know, I watched 2 other fathers come in that night, and they didn't understand. They didn't know that boys are going to be, and girls are going to be girls. And you got to let them have a few experiences." So Sin City is part of that experience process, and much of what's considered sin by some real rural standards is not sin in Iowa City and should not be. Anyway, long answer to an interesting comment.
Are there more questions? Yes, Bob?
One more. I recently came into possession of an old beer bottle that had the label of Iowa Brewing Company, Iowa City. So I referred to Irving Weber. I knew that he had written something about the Iowa Brewing Company. And that bottle would have contained Erlanger beer, the beer that made Milwaukee jealous.
Yep, that's a good story. That's true.
The Johnson County Historical Society now has that bottle.
Yeah, and lager beer, there were and I can't quote, I read some time ago, a 4-line couplet about in lager beer and the university student, or games, taken to games. The beer we drink at the football games is in lager, and I can't remember how it goes, but that's one of the 3 principal breweries that the beer that made Milwaukee jealous somehow comes into one of those too.
That's the one.
Yeah,
That's it.
That's the one.
yeah,
Now, the Iowa Brewing Company, you
Iowa
said?
Brewing Company.
yes,
Erlanger beer, the beer that makes Milwaukee jealous.
yes.
Yes.
Were there different ethnic taverns in Iowa City?
Were there different ethnic taverns in Iowa City?
I don't think Iowa City's built any different than any place else in that score. Yeah, there certainly were. There were, I can think of several. Well, Dunkel's is one, and I've got a postcard coming up in the next couple of weeks on Dunkel's Hotel, which the Dunkels are an interesting family in 1900 era Iowa City. And they ran the Pastime Theater. Punch Dunkel ran Pastime. But they also had the hotel over at the corner of a block south, Capitol Street and College, which is now under the shopping center, the far side of the shopping center site downtown. That hotel advertised mineral baths. And I didn't know much about mineral baths, but I went to digging. I had recalled reading something somewhere about mineral baths back in 1839, 1840. But, and I found that material, relocated that material. So that's coming in a postcard in a couple of weeks. But there are still bars in Iowa City which tend to be flavored by different ethnic groups. That's still true today, I think. I can think of, and I don't want to sound like an expert on bars or like I know the bars, because I don't, but I do keep my ears open and listen to folks. And I think that's very true.
Are there more? Yes, Barb?
Bob, could you describe the subject of the postcard that went for a couple $100?
The subject of the postcard that went for a couple $100.
Okay, that was down at Lone Tree. It was an auction at Lone Tree. And I don't know who bought it, by the way. I heard about it several weeks after the incident. I don't know whether I'm relating oral history, and I don't know how accurate oral history ever is. But, so I don't know exactly the card. I think I do, but I'm not 100% certain. And it is a card that has, it's a thick one, and it has a flap that opens up, and you pull out from under the flap a long strip of pictures. I think there are 10 on a side or 20 total, pictures that fold in an accordion right down into the card. And I have several of those kind of cards. And so, and that's what was, the way it was described to me, I was flabbergasted at the price. And I said, what kind of a card would sell like that? Well, the way the person described it to me indicates which card I think it was. It could have been a card I've never seen, you know, theoretically. I don't think so, but because I think the description that was given me isolated it to the card that a card I'm familiar with.
Are there more questions?
When Mark Twain got older, the doctor told him that he shouldn't smoke so many cigars. And his reply to that was, I smoke only one at a time.
You want to repeat?
When Mark Twain grew older, his doctor told him that he shouldn't smoke so many cigars, and his reply was that he only smoked one at a time.
I have a brother and sister-in-law that live in San Francisco and have for years and years and years. And I tell them of Mark Twain's quip about San Francisco, regularly remind them of it, that he said that the coldest winter he ever spent was one summer in San Francisco.
Are there more questions? Any more questions? Well, thank you so much, Bob. This is wonderful.